In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to make this retro binary animation using geometry nodes. We'll do some handy index manipulation to isolate and animate the rows left and right. And make sure you watch till the end to see how much we can use the compositor to really bring this to life. Let's get started. So let's dive into our geometry node setup here. Let's click the geometry nodes tab, click new. And as usual, we'll press X to delete the group input, Shift A, and let's bring in a grid. And this grid will convert to points using mesh to points. I want to see the points right off the bat, so we'll go into the top view. Let's actually really quick set up our camera. So click the camera up top and press Alt R, Alt G to clear the transform basically. And jump into the camera view, press G, Z, Z twice, and let's zoom out. I want to get about 30 lines or 30 rows of points. So let's throw in the Y, let's do 30. And we'll space this out quite a bit too. And the Y will spread out also. So that's probably pretty good. Now we just need to fill that in with vertices along the X. So maybe 50 is looking pretty good. We can adjust that as we need. So to break up the monotony here, let's bring in a delete geometry node. And right now it's just indiscriminately deleting everything. So let's change the selection to be a Boolean, a random value, which is a Boolean. And we'll change the probability. We'll just lower that down so it's not too broken up. You can see there's patches here. And once we get numbers on here, it'll look more like bits and bytes and it'll look pretty cool. So let's actually do that next. Let's set up our instance on points. And that just clears everything because we need to drag in the instances to this input. The two instances we'll use will be a string to curve, and we'll have the number 0. And that curve we'll fill. And for now, we can just drag that into the instance here. And we'll bring the scale way down. Something like that. Looks pretty good. So now let's Shift D. Let's shift select both of these nodes, Shift D, drag that down. And let's change this one to a 1. And I'm going to find a font that I like in my file system. Sweet, okay, so I changed that for both of these string to curves. And now we want to make these two string to curve nodes. We want to make these, I think it's like geometry to instances, geometry to instance. So if it's kind of like join geometry. If we plug both of these in, now we've got several instances coming out of this output. So we'll plug that back into the instance on points and click pick instance. And so now it just randomly assigns 0s and 1s to those points on this grid. Maybe give it a bit more separation as well along the lines. I think that's pretty cool. So what we want to do next is have these rows alternate left and right. And to do that, we're going to have to do a little bit of like index manipulation so that we can isolate each individual or each alternating row to move those, to offset those left and right. So let me show you what I mean. Let's Control Shift click the mesh to points. So we get all these points here. And if we Shift A to bring in an index node and drag that in, right now we got one black and everything else is white. And that's because these values with this viewer, black is the value of 0 and 1 or above is the value of white. And so you can see here, if you zoom in enough, the pattern is each column ends with a multiple of how many vertices we have in this grid on the Y axis. And so we can do a little bit of manipulation here on this index to change it so that an entire row is 0, and then the next row is 1, and then another row is 0, so that they alternate. And to do that, if we bring in a truncated modulo and mod it by 30, we'll just hard code that. Now you can see we're pretty close to what we want. We've got an entire row at 0, entire row at 1, entire row at 2. So then all we need to do is test if that row, if the value of that row is odd or even. And then we can assign that entire row 0 or 1. So again, we'll do the truncated modulo, but this time we'll say 2. And right away you can see how these rows alternate 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. It's a little hard to see zoomed out, but this is totally what we need to start offsetting these rows. So with that, let's zoom out here. Let's give us a bit of space And let's actually take this and just pull this over and control right click drag through that to cut it. And now what we can do is bring in a set position node, and this will be our offset to offset these rows left and right. But before we do the alternating offsets, let's just drive this so that it moves, so that it shifts to the right. And to do that, let's pull in a frame node. And with that frame, we'll divide it by our end frame down here in the bottom right corner. And we'll right click that to copy as a new driver and right click here to paste as a driver. So now these stay in sync. If I change them here, it changes in the divide node. So when we take the frame and divide it by the end frame, that gives us a percentage. If we're on frame 1 out of 250, we're basically at the very start, 0% of our animation. And if the frame is 250 out of 250, now that's 100% of our animation. So that's super handy to drive this entire animation and be able to create it to loop. So with that percentage, we're going to multiply that percentage by the width that we've got here in this size X, because we need the whole grid to shift off screen and basically another grid to shift into screen for it to loop. So let's drag this out into a group input. That will put the size X here in the modifier stack. We can always use it there to tweak it later if we want, but we'll also use that to access it here in the group input size X. So now if we take that multiply and drag that out into a combine XYZ into the X input and use that as the offset. And now if we press play, nothing's happening because we've got our viewer node still. So let's click that, press X. All right, there you can see it's starting to offset. So shift left arrow to go back to the first frame, press space to play, and now we're starting to slide everything off screen, which is good. Now we want to alternate the rows. So to do that, let's take this driver here that we've got, and we'll compare if the value, remember how the rows were 0 or 1 alternating? So with that, we can say, we can compare it, and if it's equal to 0, and we'll drag that out to a switch node, and we'll change this from geometry to float, and false we can say 1, true can be -1, it doesn't matter, you can flip them if you want. But what we need to do with this is take a multiply node here, and we'll multiply the value of this by our +1 or -1. And now when we press play, this should slide in opposite directions, which it kind of does, but only parts of the rows themselves are sliding. So what we need to do, we need to fix that. And when we did our setup with the truncated modulo, we were working with this node here. The problem is when we delete geometry over here, that's going to change the indices, the value of the indices. So what we want to do now is before we delete the geometry, we need to kind of freeze frame those values so that after the geometry is deleted, the indices still retain their original index value, like the post truncated modulo values. So it's a little confusing, but let me show you. Shift A to capture the attribute, and we'll Shift A to add an index node. So we'll capture that index, and then the delete geometry can do whatever it wants and change up the change up the index values however it wants. But once it's captured and we freeze frame those values, we'll plug this value into this truncated modulo because this index node no longer reflects the original values that we wanted to work with. So we can press X to delete that. And now go back to the first frame and press spacebar. Good, sweet. So now we're starting to alternate rows, the animation. And to make this loop, we need to have basically 3 grids, and we need to set our camera so it's in the middle grid. And then as the animation plays, the rows will come in and out of the picture. And at the end of the animation, you'll end up having the original grid in the middle. All right, so to duplicate the geometry, let's Shift A and bring in a duplicate elements node here. And it defaults to points, which is why it messes everything up. So we'll just change that to instances. So now it's going to duplicate all of these instances 3 times, since we said 3 times. So they're all just stacked on top of each other. So let's offset those. We can take this duplicate index and multiply it by the group input, that X, the size X that we had. And we can Shift D the set position And I think if we combine this out into an X, combine X, and plug that into the offset, it should lay these out next to each other, which it looks pretty good. It looks like there's a bit of a layout artifact here and there. You can see the borders. We might be able to change that. Okay, I'm going to try to fix that. Let's drag out a bounding box node here. I've run into this in past projects as well. Once you instantiate, or once you put instances on points, the width or the dimensions of the geometry changes depending on the geometry of the instances. So let's realize instances here. Now we've got our min and max for this bounding box, and we can take the max and subtract the min and then extract the X value there. And I wonder if this X, if we plug that into size X, it offsets it a little bit, but it's still not perfect. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But at the same time, I want these three to be offset so that the camera's looking at the middle of the three grids. So let's shift the set position yet one more time. And we'll use the separate XYZ and combine that into this X input and change this offset. But we need to first shift this multiply it by -1 to shift that the other way. So I don't know if this is going to loop properly. It looks like it's not looping properly. So let's do a bit of debugging. Right now it's kind of hard to see what's going on because of all the noise. So let's click the camera here and go into the viewport display. Camera tab here, and viewport display, and crank the passport 2 up. And if we shift left and right to the end frames, yeah, that's definitely not adding up. I'm going to try plugging this back in. Okay. So what I'm going to do is frame 251 should be the exact same as frame 1. So frame 1 and your end frame plus 1 should be exactly the same for it to loop, which I can kind of see that that's the case, except if you look at the very edge and then shift right arrow to go back, you see this layout artifact. So I'm going to kind of just, I don't know what the calculation is, but I'm going to grab the camera, press G, ZZ, and shift, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit like that, just to crop out that duplicated area. And now if we go 251 and back to frame 1, it's a perfect loop. I'm happy with that. All right, if you know what the calculation is or the miscalculation, let me know in the comments, because that's a mystery. All right, let's throw basic material on here. Shift A, set material. And we're just gonna have the one material, so we'll use that. And we'll come in here, I guess emission. We'll give it a basic, kind of a tealish green, strength of 10 maybe to start. And we'll go in here to rendered. Okay, and also go into the world tab, turn the strength down to 0 so we just have black. So this is really dull, and we're actually going to bring it seriously to life in the compositor. Now, this is the most compositing I've ever done in a tutorial, so we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. So let's click new, and here is our image coming in, and our image going out and into the viewer. First thing I want to try doing is bring in this glare node, and we'll change that to bloom. High quality. Oh, right. And let's go up to the top, and in this drop down here, the shading drop down, change the compositor to be always. There's a lot of hoops you gotta jump through now to get bloom. So that's super strong. Let's bring the strength and size down. We'll just play with that until we get kind of a glow we like. Again, trust me, this is gonna look really cool in the end. That's not bad. I like that. It's a good start. So what I want to try doing now is let's add in some scan lines, kind of like we'll make kind of like a retro CRT effect. So to do that, we've got our image here. We can pull that out into an image coordinates, and we'll take the normalize output here and plug that into a checker texture vector. So just like we do with geometrynodes or the shader in the compositor, you can Control-Shift-Click. That'll let us view the output here. So we get this checker texture. We don't want the checker, but we do want the alternating stripes. So let's bring in a vector math node, and we'll set this to multiply. And we'll change this to something high like 30. And right away, you can see that we get these lines. I think that's pretty good by default. All right, so let's bring in a mixed color now. Let's add these to the image. And we want this checker texture to be multiplied on top of the image. So now you start to get some scan. One thing that we can do if we want to give this a bit of motion just in the scan lines themselves is we can take the frame. And I believe this is now a Blender 5 feature where the Compositor has a lot of similar nodes that the shader editor had as well, which is super cool. So we can take this frame and we can throw in a math node. We'll change this to multiply and we'll just slow down the frame by 0.025. And then let's combine that into the Y input of a combine XYZ. And this multiply, shift D that and add this vector. So now, depending on how slow it is, we should see, it's actually really hard to see with that motion going on. So let's mute those and press play. And you can see the scan lines kind of moving. They're kind of small, let's say 20. I think that's better, maybe 25. So a little bit of motion going on. Let's unmute these. And we can try adjusting this gray. If you go all the way black, it gets too broken up, but we can darken it a little bit. I think that's pretty good. The final piece to the CRT effect is to bring in a lens distortion. We'll plug that in and we will distort. We'll distort this like crazy and click fit. That's pretty cool. Okay, so a couple more things to add. Let's just do a curves node. Let's do an RGB curves node and we'll give it a bit of just contrast with this S curve like so. And we can also bring in a vignette to blur or fade the edges. And we don't want a factor of 1 because that makes it completely black in the corners. But if we reduce that factor, it just fades out just a little bit. So that's pretty cool. And I actually want these, and instead of just blacks or like darker blacks in the corner, I want to add in a bit of red. And the red gives it a bit of warmth, a more retro vibe, and it looks really nice. It kind of has PlayStation vibes actually. So let's shift A and we'll bring in a mixed color and we'll use this mask from the vignette, which you can look at with Control Shift click. So this is our mask. So anywhere that's black will be image A and anywhere that's white will be image B. It'll be mixed to this color. And this color we want to be some kind of red. So if we look at this result now and use that mask to drive the factor, now we start to get the original image with some reds in the corner, which we can change to add. And then we can just tweak the value and the saturation here. And I might change the distortion a little bit as well. I'm gonna go back to the material and just change this color here a bit. I think I like a bit of a warmer green, especially in contrast with that red. It seems to really pop. That's pretty good. I like that. So now this might be the last layer. Let's try kind of brightening up the middle using that same mask. So just Shift D, this add, and we'll take this same image here and pull in a hue saturation value. And taking this mask again, if we play with the hue slider, you can see that it's actually changing the outside. We want to change the inside. So let's bring in an invert color node, put that on the mask. I'm going to pull that out of the way. And then we'll change the hue just a little bit to get a bit of yellow. What about the value? We can increase the value a bit as well. So if we pull in a color ramp and connect that before we invert the color, we can change this black to be a bit grayer so it's not so intense. I don't know if that's making a huge difference. It looks like it is. There's a bit of green here. It's a bit warmer and brighter in the middle. So it's subtle, but it does add a bit of extra warmth to it, so I like that. Okay, last thing we're gonna try doing is taking the scale and just playing with this scale. I think that looks pretty good. Let's hit play. And I like that. I like how that feels. We're probably playing at 24 frames per second. I'm gonna want this to be 60 frames per second. So if we go into the output tab and change it to 60, And now everything moves a lot faster. So we need to slow it down with the end frame. You can just set that to 1,000. Because we've got this hooked up to the end frame, there's no problem changing it. And I think we're pretty much good to render. Let's go into the render tab here. I don't see anything that I want to change here. Let's go into the output. I'm going to set this to 2560 by 1440. So it's 1440p. And 60 frames is good. I'm going to output a video. And if we go into the encoding down here, we can change from Matryoshka to MPEG-4. You can leave it at H.264, color depth 8 is good. And the output quality can change to perceptually lossless. And after that, you can go into the render tab and render the animation. So that's it for today's design and tutorial. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed it. And this was my first time on camera, which was a little bit different for me, but I'm really looking forward to being able to connect more with the Blender community as I continue to do these tutorials. Thank you so much for your support. Give the video a like so other people can discover it as well, and be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.